the differences between how law enforcement handled the huge crowd on Wednesday and how law enforcement handled the crowds through 2020. And we also noticed that overwhelmingly the crowd Wednesday was white. And there seemed to be a sense of entitlement. Robert Jones, the author of this book, tweeted this week that what we witnessed was an unholy amalgamation of white supremacy and Christianity. He pointed to the religious symbols of a Christian flag, shofar, and references to Jericho. So this feels timely. We're joined today by Rich Hannon, who brought this to the attention of the Spectrum community. Rich is a retired software engineer, currently columns editor at Spectrum magazine website. He's been associated with Adventist Forum for many years, previously being on the board, as well as being the moderator of the website comments for multiple years. So he really needs extra gifts and love for that job that he did. Aside from his professional background in computer science, he's had longstanding interests in such disparate areas as philosophy, medieval history, geology, and economics. And I'm always challenged by the comments that he makes and by the columns that he writes. So welcome, Rich.
Thanks.
We also have Alexander Carpenter, Adventist Forum board member, host of Adventist Voices. He will be co-hosting this discussion, and I'm not sure if he's in Sacramento. He may be somewhere special. You may not want to say. It's an undisclosed location. But good to see you, Alex.
Great to be here. I'm in the desert, in the Coachella Valley.
Okay, good. Alyssa Williams manages the website at Spectrum Magazine. We're grateful for her work and for her contributions to this effort of Friday Forum. Good to see you, Alyssa.
Good to be here. Thank you, Carmen.
And then Bonnie Dwyer is the editor of Spectrum Magazine for over 20 years, and she's always an interesting conversationalist. So I'm glad that you're part of this group, Bonnie, and it's good to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. It's always a pleasure. This group has got me reading things that I wouldn't have read otherwise, and I'm already very grateful to be part of this group.
So the author, Robert Jones, does something in this book. He weaves together personal memoir, theological reflection, and statistical analysis to show how white supremacy infects American Christianity and continues to do so. It's a searing expose, and it encourages the reader to go beyond kind of a superficial justice warrior label. We have witnessed, at least I have in my lifetime, I would call it a white Christian shuffle. We go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We lament our past sins, but ultimately refuse to acknowledge the costly actions and to do the hard work of reparation in the present, whatever that may be. It seems like white Christians just want to be forgiven and know that we're living here now and that there's no accountability for the structures that are in place. White churches provide a strong sense of safety and a sense of an individual religion that gives a person security. Robert Jones, this author, is the founder and CEO of PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute. He has a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And in 2016, he wrote a book entitled End of White Christian America. I've never read it. I was not aware of it until I started researching this. So I wanted to ask a few questions to get the discussion going. And first, I just wonder how Rich stumbled upon this book and kind of his thought processes as he decided to write about it for Spectrum.
So I guess I learned about the book, I'm thinking, from one of Jennifer Rubin's columns, who writes for the Washington Post. I'm a strong advocate of reading her columns. She writes 2 or 3 a day, so I do not know how that lady puts that much words out, but she references Robert Jones quite frequently. His book came out in the summer, and I think that's where I first came to recognizing it existed. But the motivation for writing the column has to do with my feelings of frustration and impotence as a privileged white man who does not like what I am seeing in the Christian community, with the white Christian community in the US, with their strong association with racism and the right wing. When George Floyd was killed and Black Lives Matter protests happened through the summer, you want to do something. You want to help. So what do? Well, the state that I live in, you can vote, but it's pretty much big whoop because of the way we're structured. So my vote doesn't matter a whole lot. I can send a few bucks to a worthy cause, and I do. And so that's great. I could even go outside and carry a sign. But for the most part, you feel completely impotent to actually make a difference. So when I thought about what difference I could make, there was practically nothing, but there was one arena, and that is I write for Spectrum. And I know that if I submit a manuscript to Alyssa, she'll give it serious consideration because I have a history with the organization. And so when I looked at Robert Jones's book and I read it, I said, you know, this needs to get out. And so I asked when Alyssa or the others on a web team call, is anybody going to write a review on this? And if they are, terrific. I'm not interested in spending the time if somebody can do a good job, and nobody stepped up. So I felt like, okay, this is something I can do. It's not very much, and it really isn't very much, but I felt like it needed to be done. It needs to get out there to the Spectrum readers. Conversations like this need to happen because what Jones is talking about is really, really important. And so that was my motivation.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you did. Yeah, I appreciated it. And I guess, Alexander, you mentioned last week that you had been following Robert Jones for a while. And so how come you're so enlightened and has known about him for a long time? I mean, of course, we would know that you're ahead of the curve, but tell us your interaction with him and how you became aware of this body of work that he's on top of.
It's, thanks for those kind words. They're not justified, but I looked on Twitter after we started this, and I saw that he joined Twitter February 2009. I joined Twitter March 2009. And I actually knew about him before that. And it's because he's had a really interesting career as a thinker in American Christianity. He had academic training actually in math and computers at Mississippi College, which he writes about in the book. And then he was going on a academic track with his PhD from Emory in religion. But I learned about him in the mid-aughts when I was at the Center for American Progress during a summer, part of a public religion initiative, and he was consulting at the time there. And I thought it was really interesting for somebody who has the academic credentials that he has to spend so much time crunching numbers and working as a consultant in politics. And so I am just happy that we're having a conversation about his interests here, because he's been a very provocative, maybe you could call him a public intellectual for the last 15 years or so. And what he's been saying for a while is I think increasingly obvious to more and more people.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned his background with math and statistics, and because that's where he's really made a name for himself. And I often, now that I'm aware of him, I hear people quote him, and he's a go-to source to help understand what Christians in the U.S. are thinking, particularly about race. And I did resonate, he mentions also being in Georgia, and I grew up in Savannah. And so as I heard him kind of learn and become aware and kind of have this epiphany, about his ancestors. I don't know if you remember that in the book, like near the end, he's talking about, his ancestors weren't wealthy, but his great grandfather, did own a few enslaved humans, and that was actually the big bulk of his net worth listed as when he died, like in 1810 or 1820. And yeah, that just kind of hit him, and it hit me too. But I wanted to ask Bonnie, as editor, and thinking about what do you think of his format, and as far as the potential for changing hearts and minds, like this type of format of a book. What do you think? And then I also was thinking about one of his sections, believing, and how he kind of connects what we believe with what we do. And so I wondered if you'd talk about those things, Bonnie.
Sure. The combination that he brings, as Alex has mentioned, his background with numbers, as well as his personal experience within the Baptist community, and the theology and the history, how the history and theology impact each other, I think make this book extraordinarily effective. I've read any number of manuscripts that are, here's the data from a poll, and this tells you that. But there's so much that data doesn't tell you. It gives you one piece of the picture. It doesn't give you the whole picture. And so I think he's effective because he's looking at the numbers, and the numbers are incredibly important and do tell a significant story. But the rest of the story that he digs into helps you understand why the numbers are so significant. And so I thought his use of everything that he had at his disposal made for a very effective book. And in this chapter on believing, which he essentially tells you how how lost cause theology developed, I found really intriguing, because I'm used to theological discussions being a list of Bible texts. And, this is what we string together to pull us to this position. And there is nothing that is said about a lot of times, not always, not if you're in a Kendra Holoviak class, where context matters, but in so many expositions of theology, we don't get context for the text itself, for our reading of the text. We just kind of mix and match and come up with what we want it to say. And he does an amazing job of showing the interplay of history with theology, and how we have a tendency to read back into the Bible what we want it to say. And so the discussion also, in addition to lost cause theology, talks about paradoxes. How can people hold the idea of Jesus and his love for everyone, and at the same time think that it's okay to discriminate against Black people and that white people are superior? How do you hold those two ideas together? And so there is a significant discussion of that, and a theological discussion, because he points out one of the things being premillennialism, and the soon coming of Jesus, making it so that, we don't have to care about social justice. Jesus is going to come and that's all going to change. So why do we have to bother doing anything about it? And the other one that he zeroed in on, and the premillennialism and this one about Jesus saving individuals were ones that spoke to me as an Adventist, and that I've heard within our tradition. But he talked about this preoccupation with personal salvation, meaning that what happens in the community doesn't matter. It's Jesus saves individuals, but it makes it seem like he doesn't care about what goes on beyond those individuals. And he is not trying to say that that isn't important, that Jesus saves individuals, because that is how we all come to salvation, is in a personal manner. But he is also saying that social justice is important. Look at those Old Testament prophets, see what they are saying. Hear them say that justice must roll down like water, and pay attention to that beautiful community that Christ is talking about when he's talking about the body of Christ. And the body of Christ is really important, not just single individual. So that all was wrapped up into that whole discussion of believing, and was very, I thought, worth the whole book, was reading that one chapter on helping us see the context for our own personal religion and community religion, and how do we impact that. I echo Rich's thoughts of, okay, now that I've read it, what do I do? How do I make some kind of a difference? And I think Rich, Barry Black would be so proud of you, Rich, because you showed that words matter, and that speaking up is important. So I think using our individual voices, even if it's just, with our friends, I think it makes a difference.
Did you want to say something, Rich? Let me give you an opportunity. I couldn't read your face.
No, that's okay. Well,
Okay.
I mean, there was a number of things, but I don't want to digress from your outline. I mean,
Oh no, we can.
so I mean, one of the things we should talk about before we're done is what you said, Bonnie, about the idea. The term I use is siloing or bracketing. How can people, on the one hand, do something horrific? Like in my review, I quoted at length from the 1899 lynching of that man in Georgia. And you have people who go to Sunday school and kneel down and pray, and I suspect are honest in their hearts at that moment. And then they hop the train to go to the lynching. There's a certain siloing of our mentalities that allow us to abstract our Christianity away from real life. And the other thing, which we can get into if we want to at some point before we're done, is Adventism, because of its historical emphasis on eschatology, has always had this, we can't be dealing with the messy human problems of today. We're supposed to be preaching the second coming. I mean, the Salvation Army does that. And so we focus on the otherworldly stuff to come, and the things that are needed to be done right now, well, ain't our problem, man. So it's a failing of the denomination simply because of the trajectory we have taken for so long.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of research floating into the public sphere about, abolition and some of the more intentional things that early church fathers did. When I mean early Adventists were doing to try to improve their situation, but certainly it seems like that has been kind of tamped down out of our awareness. And I remember and maybe 15 years ago when I read my first N.T. Wright book, one of his simple ones, maybe Simply Christian or some sweet title like that. and I shared it with a friend here, an elderly woman who also read it. And we were just shocked with the idea that he brings about, that the kingdom of heaven is now. Like, Jesus didn't just bring the promise of the afterlife, but he was bringing the promise of something now. And why was that a new idea to me? But it felt very fresh and new at the time. And that's kind of what, we're too much in this afterlife and individualism. But before we move on, I did want to say too, as you were speaking, Bonnie, about this type of book and the combination of story and data and theology, it made me think about our purpose at Adventist Forum and the types of things that we're trying to do on our platforms. The journal and the website is the combination of those different types of stories to further the kingdom. I mean, it can't just be data, it can't just be theology. So all of a sudden I connected, like, oh, well, maybe this is the type of thing that you've dedicated your life to doing, Bonnie and Alyssa and Rich. So I'm seeing maybe we're all in the same vein a little bit with him. But, as we think about how this does apply to Adventism, I think Alyssa had mentioned that she was thinking about this. And I know you've been at Andrews that has had, I mean, you weren't a student there, but you've been in that location and they've had some awakenings in the last few years. And I wondered if you might share some of your thoughts about application.
Sure. So I was actually a student at Andrews. To give you a little brief background on me, I was born and raised on campus. My parents rented a little house right across from Pioneer Memorial Church, and my parents both worked at Andrews my whole, they worked there for 35 years. So I literally was raised on campus running around the buildings. And it was in some ways a really idyllic Adventist upbringing. I have so many lovely memories of Andrews, and I will always consider it home. And I feel very blessed and fortunate to have been raised in such a diverse community. I believe these days Andrews is ranked #1 for diversity, the most diverse university in the country, or at least tied for that title by U.S. News and World Report. But at the same time, it was a confusing upbringing because there were quite a few incidents that I've experienced over the years of white supremacy mentalities at Andrews, racist ideology from fellow white people. The very first one I remember was when I was 4 years old. And, I attended the daycare at Andrews, and of course had friends who were from all over the world. And one of my best friends was a little Black boy. We were both 4 years old, and the daycare teacher was very concerned about our friendship and pulled me aside as a 4-year-old and told me, because I think we had decided at 4 years old that we were going to get married, right? As 4-year-olds do. And so the daycare teacher pulled me aside and said, little Black boys and little white girls don't get married, and people want to have babies that are the same color as they are. And I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't understand. And I went home and I told my parents what she had said, because I was very confused. And of course, my parents were livid. That's not the type of thing I ever heard at home. And they went and they confronted the teacher, but of course, nothing happened. She wasn't fired. She continued to work there for many years. And, in high school, I had a friend who very sincerely, very earnestly talked at length to anyone who would listen about the curse of Ham and how Black people were inferior. And this is at Andrews Academy. And she was a student leader of Bible groups and all sorts of things. And believed very passionately that anyone who intermarried would not be going to heaven, and their children would not be going to heaven. And so being raised in this, and I also worked at Andrews for a time. I'm trying to figure out how many of these examples to give, honestly, today, because it's difficult to have lived in this dichotomy of this beautiful, diverse community, and then also hearing this rhetoric growing up and not knowing how to process it or what to do with it. But I also worked at Andrews for several years before coming to Spectrum, and the kinds of conversations that happened behind closed doors when all of the people in the room were white, that decisions that were made that had direct harm for Black employees, that had direct harm for Black students. These are things that happen at our flagship university. These are things that happen in our church, and we can't have a conversation. We can't pretend like we're the exception to the rule. You know, Robert Jones, in his book White Too Long, he never once mentioned Seventh-day Adventism, but he very well could have, because white supremacy is alive and well in our church as well. And you know, I really appreciated his book because he really gave voice and research and also context, and brought in a lot of other denominations to the conversation, to things that I've been thinking about and trying to wrestle with for years. And so it was a really important book to read, especially in the context of what's been happening this week. But to kind of summarize my thoughts on Adventism and white supremacy, I'll just read, if it's okay, a brief excerpt. I had something I wrote about 1.5 years ago after the El Paso shooting that went viral on Twitter and caught the attention of an Episcopal priest, Gail Fisher Stewart, who included it in an anthology called Preaching Black Lives Matter, which is this lovely book full of amazing writers, and I'm incredibly humbled to have been included in it. But I just want to read a couple paragraphs that I wrote that at the time was me trying to figure out how white supremacy has so invaded Adventism. And this was my thoughts at the time. I think these are still my thoughts, but I would love to hear what other people think of it as well. So this is what I said. Because we evangelize through fear, the people who are attracted to our message are often those who have already been radicalized in other ways. Let me put this plainly. Our fear-based evangelism attracts white supremacists. The overlap in the Venn diagram of white supremacy and Adventism is larger than we'd like to admit, and it all stems from that same place of radicalized ideology against those who are somehow different from us. This is why the Adventist Church is so uncomfortable denouncing the cancer that is white supremacy. It's our cancer too. We can't denounce it without admitting the infection is in us as well. These are the questions on my mind as time after time our church is complicit with its silence. The answer is pretty simple. We must denounce white supremacy from our pulpits and our pews, whether an Adventist with a huge platform or no platform at all. And in the process of denouncing this evil, maybe we'll also be better equipped to recognize the ways our own religion has radicalized us toward hate and fear. Only then can we move toward the radical love of Jesus.
Oh, wow. Beautifully done. Yeah, fear is behind a lot of this, isn't it? And that seems to be in our DNA somehow with how we have gone about bringing people into the fold quite often. Yeah, so it seems like our strong stance on religious liberty has confused our vision as to how can we be useful in the common good, in the public square. And, you know, we've kind of got two competing things, this siloed religious liberty versus, yes, we want to contribute to the public square. And so, Alex, could you reflect a little on that? Do you see a way forward or some key things we should be tethering our life actions to?
Sure. Thanks for sharing your writing, Alyssa, and thanks, Rich, for really initiating this discussion, and thanks for hosting, of course, Carmen. I'll do two word language changes that I take from the book, and then one shift, and then I want to loop back to actually that idea of fear from Alyssa. So one language change that I really appreciate from him that I'm going to stop saying probably increasingly, let me say it that way, is white supremacy. I really like how he flips that to supremacy of whites there in the beginning of the book. And that's a helpful turn of phrase for me, supremacy of whites, because that helps me think of it not as like a monolithic group, and I think other folks who might not really understand that they're part of that structure of supremacy. So I like pluralizing it to supremacy of whites. And then moving past language of racial reconciliation, as he talks about at the end of the book, to talking about racial justice. I continue to hear that kind of language, and I know folks who, even in the group Adventists for Social Justice, really wants Adventist congregations to stop. I'm paraphrasing here, so I don't want to put this in as their language, but you get folks who saw something horrible on TV and they want to assuage their guilt, and so they want to sit down and have a conversation about reconciliation. And as Jones points out, and lots of African American thinkers and activists point out, it's not about what happens is they often have to sit there and listen to someone say, hey, I'm really sorry about this. And then on the other side, they're expected to say what they're sorry about, and they haven't done anything wrong. And so that idea that reconciliation, this kind of two-way thing, it's not like me sitting down with my wife and saying, hey, sorry about this, you're sorry about this, all right, let's go on. There is a structure of violence and assault for 400 years, and having a kind of mutual interrogation is not as constructive as we want it to be. And so I think the language around justice, recognizing that there's been a wrong committed, and then talking about that truth and the history that's involved is really helpful. And it gets us to the same place, which is people who are with goodwill trying to be better and create a better society. So those are the two language shifts for me. As an growing up Adventist, we're familiar with that separation of church and state language and how helpful that's been for us in preserving our religious liberty and our identity. And I think what Jones does really well is helps us recognize that, at least if we're talking about the history of religion in America, that religion and politics were intimately connected. He gives so many great anecdotes of those Baptist ministers propping up the politicians in the South, and we know that's nothing new. So I think that there was a reaction against that, and Adventists sort of said, hey, we're here for that, which is a sort of pietistic, let's not get involved with politics. But what's happened is that we've been tricked, I would say, in that what's happened is by removing ourselves from the public sphere, we've muted our Christian witness. We've sort of made a bargain with the devil and said, hey, we won't say anything bad about you if you don't call us a cult or say that we're too weird. And I think that what he does so well is calls us to a public witness again, that there are wrongs in the past connected to our theology. And that leads me to what Alyssa was writing. And it's a kind of a question for you, or something that I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, is because he points out that in the South, the structure of the supremacy of whites, especially embodied in the KKK, was very bigoted towards Catholics. And of course, Adventists have really done a great job in our evangelistic, really the funnel of humans and money into our organization, by demonizing Catholics in our evangelistic series. And I can just, I want to read more about some sociological analysis of how that was successful in bringing Protestants who are like, yeah, we hate the Catholics so much, I didn't realize we're worshiping on their day. I'm going to be even more white Protestant and be an Adventist. Now, I don't know if that's true. Obviously, it's pure conjecture, but I'm just curious how much we benefited from that kind of religious bigotry. So looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that or anything else.
Alyssa, did you think about Catholics when you were writing that piece? Was that kind of part of your
I did, and and earlier in the piece I mentioned that actually of just our kind of, I think, obsession with Catholics and the Catholic Church and the Pope and just demonizing all of it. And I think there are quite a number of Adventists who feel very comfortable doing that and very much in the right of like, well, but that's just the truth, and white supremacists feel the same way about Black people. Well, it's just the truth that white people, and so we have kind of these parallel ways of approaching our ideology of like, we're set apart, we're superior, we're the remnant. And so we are within our right and we're entitled to, and we have this like role, this God-given role of telling the world of our superiority. And the way that we as Adventists do that against Catholics, the way that white supremacists do it against Black people and Jewish people and people of color in general, I wonder, can our core doctrines be correct, and yet the way that we present them to the world be so wrong and so harmful? Is that, or because I think that that's where we start to, the conversation starts to break down, because we think that if we have a conversation about the way in which we evangelize and the way in which we present ourselves being harmful, then that means that we're throwing it all out and that we're saying our doctrines are incorrect because of our approach. And that's not what I'm saying, but I think that we have this knee-jerk reaction. But I think the conversation needs to be had. And I also, this is pivoting, so sorry for that, but I also think we'd be remiss in this conversation today if we don't mention, Robert Jones spends a lot of time mentioning how I think specifically the Baptists and the Methodists split to have kind of a white organization and a Black organization. And obviously we all are very familiar with the fact that Adventism is split along a color line as well, with the state conferences, which are traditionally white, and the regional conferences, which are traditionally Black. And I think Jones does a really great job of talking about how white people, the way that the conclusions that I was coming to when he was talking, especially in his final chapters, about, I feel like white people are so, we were uncomfortable, and so we forced Black people out of our church and they had to create regional conferences. But now we're uncomfortable with regional conferences because it makes us look bad. So now we're like, we all just need to come back together. We've said we're sorry. You just need to forgive us because we're uncomfortable again. And so we continue to center, white people continue to center ourselves in this and say our discomfort needs to be the catalyst for change one way or the other, and we get to control that. And obviously that's harmful. That's shouldn't be how it is. And I think we as white people need to sit in our discomfort and need to use that as a time for reckoning, because we want so badly to not be uncomfortable that we are trying to skip steps. And Jones weaves throughout his book this beautiful story of I believe it's two Baptist churches, the white one and a black one, that are both called like the First Baptist Church. And they're like, what, across the street from each other or something. And they've really taken steps to join together in recent years to be to get to know each other, to create a community. And one of the pastors, he quotes at length as saying, I hope it's okay if I read it. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. But
fine, we're interested.
the pastor is quoted as saying, I've stopped using the word reconciliation for what we're doing. I've started using justice work more, not saying racial reconciliation, but really talking about racial justice. When we throw around the word reconciliation, especially as white Christians, white people, we're betraying our desire to just kind of move through all of the hard stuff just to get to the happy stuff. So when we're talking about justice work, for me, we're getting into these much stickier questions of what has been lost, what is owed. And I think we in the Adventist church do the same thing. We want to skip over these steps and just like, we all need to come back together. We need to merge the conferences, and then we'll all be one big happy family. And we won't have to actually deal with what happened and why regional conferences exist in the first place. So.
Thank you.
One of the things Jones talks about in his book that is along those lines is the idea of making this reconciliation a transaction. So what we're supposed to do here is, we didn't lynch those people. And sure, our ancestors did these bad things. So tell me what I'm supposed to do. Should I apologize? Okay, hey, I'll apologize. This is like the Catholic Church apologizing for Galileo 300 years after the fact. It's cheap. It's the analogous to cheap grace, because we don't have to do anything. Just have to say, gee, I'm sorry. Now let's move on with the status quo. And he really starts to hammer that is not acceptable.
Yeah, I love that you've done that. And I remember we had the conference on atonement a few years ago, which we were talking about atonement is more than a transaction, and it has a whole rich meaning for all of life, for ourselves and how we relate to one another when we look at justice and setting things right in a broader way than just this transaction. But we have 15 minutes left, and I wanted to open it up to people on the Zoom call. If you want to speak, raise your hand and we will acknowledge you. We're glad you're here. And then also, Alex, if anyone has written anything in Facebook Live, you could share that too. Thanks. Kendra, it's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for this conversation. I've been thinking about, since Rich mentioned the idea of silos, and I get that point, and it baffles me a lot how people can pray in church and then make sure they pray quickly enough so they can be out in time for the lynching. As I've read these stories in American history, it just baffles me. And yet, if I'm understanding Jones's book, isn't he suggesting, and this to me was what was most problematic for me to digest, was the idea that white American Christianity is actually built on the foundation of the supremacy of whites, so that it shouldn't maybe surprise us that one could do both of those actions on the same Sunday. And so I guess I just want to reflect with you all a little bit more on that. What does this mean for those of us who call ourselves Christians in America today, that we're part of a community of faith based upon the supremacy of whites? And so I'm wondering what that means, and if one of our responses might be to say, as a Christian in America, I want to purposefully, intentionally embrace Black Christianity, and renounce the foundation of the supremacy of whites that is so prevalent in white Christianity. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out for observation and reflection on the part of those of you who've been thinking about these things.
Can I jump in there? I've really appreciated the way that you said that, Dr. Holoviak. And it made me think. I was at the Adventist for Social Justice conference shortly after president of the General Conference, Ted Wilson, had made some really ill-considered remarks about African-American worship styles and their music. And it caused a big furor, which was covered by Spectrum. And what he was doing was operating off of a white supremacy of whites assumption about what's proper for Christians in that context, which is sort of terrifying.
Thank you. Yeah. Mary Christian, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And I really appreciated getting to hear the discussion, and it's very much a thought-provoking and troubling book. I'm thinking about what Kendra said a moment ago about how does one deal with the fact that one's faith is rooted, that one's faith since its beginning in this country has been intertwined with the idea of the supremacy of whites, and thinking about whether embracing Black Christianity, or either in terms of the organizations or in terms of its religious practices, that's something that I've been thinking. That's something that's come to my mind as I've been reading the book, and what kind of comes back to my mind when I wonder about that idea is, well, supposing I started attending a Black church, supposing I started learning from the ways in which Black churches do Christianity and understand the Bible and the way they serve or organize in their communities. If I did all that, I would still be a white Christian, and joining a Black church, at least for me, it would not get rid of my personal racial biases, and it will not get rid of the fact that I have benefited from the greater wealth that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have been able to accumulate that they wouldn't have been able to if they were Black. And I guess my thought is regarding that idea of embracing Black Christianity, if one is a white Christian who wants to do better, my thought would be, I think there's, for me anyway, I think there's definitely much that could be gained by learning from Black Christian people and organizations, and finding what they are doing to combat racism and find ways to support that, but as a way of kind of getting rid of the complicity of one's own faith heritage I don't really feel like that's an answer. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. That was more a comment. But
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for reflecting. Bonnie.
I think it's interesting that as we go to, so what is our response supposed to be? We immediately go to that personal response as opposed to a community response, which is essentially doing exactly what he said led to one of these problems to start with. It's all about, if we only look at our own personal self and not at the larger community, I, it, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And I think that reckoning with the fact that as Adventists, we're an American religion. We are birthed in American Christianity, and acknowledging that within our history and what that means, and talking about how we have struggled with it, and having a conversation about our struggle over years, I think is important. I don't think the regional conference, state conference separation is a simple black-white one anymore, because Blacks approach that conversation very differently than whites do. And I think we need to, as whites, acknowledge that our feelings of supremacy kind of were forceful in that being created, but that also ended up, there were other things beyond just that separation that affected, and that it has helped to create. We don't have a separate denomination. We have one, and we have Blacks all the way through the hierarchy of the organization. I mean, we have struggled with this issue. We need to continue struggling with it. There's more that needs to be done. But we're in a different place than some other denominations in our conversation. One of the most moving presentations, I guess one should say, at the American Academy of Religion meetings 2 or 3 years ago, David Gushee, who was president of the American Academy of Religion, gave his presidential address. And this was a year after Trump had been elected. And he got up, and his lecture started with an apology as a leader within evangelical Christianity for the support that evangelical Christianity had given to the election of Donald Trump. It was the most amazing presentation. He essentially stood up and said, "Forgive us."
Yeah.
We were complicit in something that we shouldn't have been complicit in. And the power of confession, the power of a search for forgiveness was an incredible thing to watch. And so I think if we can, as members of Adventism, help with the conversation within our organization in terms of what do we need to apologize for, but how do we keep the conversation going past apology? And like those 2 churches in the book that are having a justice conversation, how do we make the justice conversation happen within Adventism? And is whether that is a actual going to a Black church, Mary, or maybe it's having a personal conversation with a Black person that you're acquainted with, another English professor, and getting the conversations going at the individual level so that we can help the denomination as a whole continue its push for justice and for a church that reflects the Christ that we love.
Thank you. I wanted to circle back to Kendra to see if you would come up with some other thoughts. I mean, you brought up this great connection, and I wanted to give you time, Kendra.
Oh, thanks. I'm still very much on a journey with these questions. Pastor Kazar Ackerman, who's here with us today, and I are right now taking a class at La Sierra University, a graduate class on African American biblical interpretation. And this is, I'm embarrassed to say, the first time I've ever taught this. But my hope and prayer is that in the course of this quarter, we will find some theological resources that are going to help us and be more able to articulate the ways in which Black American Christianity has provided amazing insights both into scripture and into ecclesiology, into how we do church. So again, I acknowledge that I'll never not be white, but I can, I think I can have a heart that is ever more open to acting in ways of justice and to be part of communities of justice. I think that I'm hopeful that we can do better. And in the context of this class, we're trying to, and I'm thrilled that the other member of our small seminar class is also a pastor. So we're going to try all quarter, every week, to not only learn the theory and theology, but also be very practical in our conversations about how to live it in our places of faith. So it's, we're just starting. This has been week 1, but I'm so glad Pastor Kazar is with us today, and that we're talking. That's a start, right? It's not good enough, but it's a start, and I'm grateful for that. So
Well,
yeah, thanks,
I'd
Carmen.
love to see your reading list for the class. I mean, if you think about it, send me an email. I'd be interested.
Sure, I'll send you. Glad
yeah.
to send the syllabus.
Yeah, because I feel the same way. I feel like this is the moment to learn from our Black Christian friends. And that's Christ's way. People that had been the least of these now are the teachers. And, I think about Bonhoeffer at Union Theological Seminary in the 1930s before he went back to Germany, and it was transformative. And I think, that's our opportunity to seek transformation and learning. We're about out of time, but I wanted to give the Spectrum team, I'd asked each of them if they had a sentence that they might share with us as we finish up on this reflection. So Rich, did you?
Sure. I wrote it down so I wouldn't screw it up. It would be that white evangelical Christianity in the US has a deep multi-generational disconnect from the reality of foundational Christian principles. That, to me, is the bottom line of the book and the sobering thing that we need to really think about.
Thank you. Alexander? Oh, muted, maybe.
Thank you. In light of what happened at Congress this week, I'll just read this line showing that I think both the actual impetus behind what drove that mob in there and why that is connected to this event that happened post Civil War. And we've seen perhaps the shirts that people were wearing, Civil War 2021, MAGA, on some of those people rushing in there. So this is from the book. They cast the occupation of the courthouse by Black elected officials as a riot rather than what they were, a defense of the results of a lawful election that ended in a massacre by the terrorists.
Thank you. Alyssa?
Yeah, well, I think the most succinct way is just to read a sentence from Robert Jones's book that says, "At this late point in our history, real reforms may arise only from the ashes of the current institutional forms of white Christianity." And there's a lot to unpack in that sentence, but I think that that's what it comes down to, is we can't keep doing Christianity the way that we always have without realizing that it's built on the backbone of white supremacy. And sometimes you need to burn the whole thing to the ground, which I realize is a really radical thing to say, but.
Right. And Kendra has just written in the chat, David Gushie's most recent book, After Evangelicalism, The Path to a New Christianity. So that may be kind of what he does in the book. Bonnie, did you have a final sentence for us?
I pulled a sentence and a half from the book on page 105, where he says that the damage this legacy of white supremacy has done to white Christians themselves. He's pointing that out. To put it succinctly, it has often put white Christians in the curious position of arguing that their religion and their God require them to aim lower than the highest human values of love, justice, equality, and compassion. And from this book, I want to reach to that higher, better self, that higher, better Christianity that takes us to those values of love and justice.
Thank you. So we will be wrapping up our Friday forum, but I'll just mention for next month, The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. Maybe you could put that in the chat, Alex, or I don't know. The Color of Compromise, Jamar Tisby. And we'll be joined by some colleagues from Andrews University, Dr. Scott Moncrief, who reviewed this for Spectrum about a year ago, and also Michael Nixon, who is VP for Diversity and Inclusion at Andrews University. So I hope that you will consider joining us again on February 12th at the same time. And thank you for your time today. It's nice to see people without masks. You all look great, and take good care. Bye.
Thank you all for being
Bye.
here today.